The book of Hebrews is one of the more obscure books in the New Testament. Despite the suggestions offered by scholars and church fathers and mothers down throughout the ages about who wrote this book, we don't really know who wrote it. Not only do we not know who wrote it, we don't know who the people were that were addressed in this book, or when they received this message. We've called it the epistle or the letter to the Hebrews, but as Tom Long in his commentary points out, this is not actually a letter, but it has all the markings of an early Christian sermon. And what I find amazing about this sermon is that it has legs, as one of my former preaching professors used to say. It doesn't stay up in transcendent concerns, but it has very real connection to the lives of this unknown congregation. We may not know if they heard this sermon in Rome, Jerusalem, Corinth, or some other part of the Roman Empire. But what is remarkable is that the issue they faced as a church is an issue that is very much contemporary to all of us. The preacher of this sermon, whether he was their installed pastor, an interim, or just the pulpit supply one Sunday, has done due diligence in learning about this congregation. And what they find is a group of people that is just plain exhausted. As Tom Long says, they are tired. They are tired of serving the world, tired of worship, tired of Christian education, tired of being peculiar and whispered about in society, tired of the spiritual struggle, tired of trying to keep their prayer life going, tired even of Jesus. Attendance at church is down and they are losing confidence. The threat to this congregation is not that they are going to go charging off in the wrong direction, but they do not have the energy to charge off anywhere. Perhaps for this congregation, whoever they were, Sunday mornings began to feel like something else to cram into their already chaotic and overscheduled lives. They didn't want to show up for fear of being cornered and volunteered for something they didn't have the time or the energy for. Perhaps church no longer felt like the life-giving place it was supposed to be, but it began to feel like a chore. Far more life-giving was turning off the alarm, rolling over, and going back to sleep before a busy work week. Hebrews is just as timely of a sermon now as it was then. How can you go on exhausted and worn out? If this is indeed a sermon of pastoral response to weariness, then a word about faith is an important word to hear. The preacher has been going for a while at this point. Hebrews is a rather lengthy sermon, and we've picked it up near the end this morning. Faith is an interesting word, isn't it? I'm glad that wasn't my kid. Not yet. If you go online to a website called Etsy, you'll find all sorts of handcrafted artisan products. It's been a good source of gifts for Heather for her birthday and for anniversaries. And if I go on there and I type in the word faith into the search bar, I'll find all sorts of products: t-shirts, signs, wall art, coffee mugs, jewelry, all sorts of things with the word faith written on it. Go down the street to Hobby Lobby, not today because it's Sunday and they're closed, but go down the street to Hobby Lobby and you walk around, you'll no doubt find the same sort of menagerie of products with the word faith written on it. It's one of those words you see everywhere, faith. But what is faith? When you read through the Gospels, the story of Jesus' life, he spends a good amount of time healing the sick and the destitute. And when he heals them, I'm struck by one of his most frequent responses. Your faith has healed you. What does that mean? Does Jesus understand faith to be a human quality that we have to muster up within ourselves? There are countless people throughout the world who have read the story of Jesus' life and seen his power to heal, and they've prayed earnestly, but then healing never comes. And when that happens, they begin to say things like, maybe I just need to have more faith. Is that what faith is really about? When sickness, woundedness, and brokenness remain in our own lives, do we need to somehow come up with more faith? Does faith arise from our own strength and our own ability? For us Western Christians, faith has easily become a cognitive exercise about the things we believe. Every Sunday we affirm our faith in the words of some creed. Is that what faith is, using our brains alone to give cognitive assent to doctrinal claims? When I was in high school, I was overly concerned with the veracity of the claims of Christianity. Was there a literal 6-day creation? How could Mary get pregnant while she was still a virgin? Did Jesus rise bodily from the dead? Were the Gospels reliable historical accounts of Jesus' life? And so I was sort of a serious kid, and I read book after book that tried to prove these claims to be true in a scientific manner. Is that what faith is? Is it just a Christian word for forensic investigation? Is faith the opposite of doubt? Do we have to check our brains at the door and suspend reason? Do we have to shove those deepest and most heartfelt questions down within ourselves? Are we to accept the dictionary definition of faith that says believing in something even when there is no evidence? Are we to have blind faith that simply accept the things that we cannot understand? But to a weary and worn-out congregation, I'm not sure any of these sorts of understandings of faith is pastorally sensitive or really all that helpful. If faith is something they have to conjure up within themselves, then I don't know that they would have had the strength to do that. If faith exists primarily in their heads and not in their hearts, certainly that would have been too fragile to maintain under the weight of their most difficult struggles. If faith is blind and just accepts what is, then maybe it would have been better that this congregation who was on the verge of walking away would have just gone ahead and done so, because they had seen too much of the ugliness of the world to just simply accept what was. Faith, this unknown preacher says to this unknown congregation, is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is about confidence. Faith is about conviction. Faith is about hope. Faith is ultimately about trust. I actually think it would be a good thing if we either replace the word faith in our dictionaries with the word trust, or just learn how to say faith and trust together. Because I think the word faith has become too cliche, too blasé, too appropriated by the larger culture. I think it carries a lot of baggage with it, and it causes us to keep faith up here rather than allowing it to take root in here. Because faith is not primarily an exercise of the mind, but it is an exercise of the heart. If faith is indeed trust, then it is not a quality that we can create for ourselves. Because we could never believe hard enough, reason ourselves into, or gather enough evidence for faith. Faith is a gift that comes from God. Faith arises when the presence of the Holy Spirit stirs up the conviction within us that we exist, we live and move and have our being in those promises of God. Faith is trusting that our lives are in God's hands. It places our trust in what God has promised is true, even when we cannot yet see it. However, our trust, our faith, is always, in the words of one scholar, an unsettled conviction. Take, for example, the story of Abraham and Sarah. You know the story from the book of Genesis, and you heard part of that story during our Old Testament reading. Abraham was living in a place called Ur of the Chaldeans within the Babylonian Empire, and he knew nothing of the God of his ancestors, the God who created the world in love. Yet this God comes to him unexpectedly and tells him to leave behind everything he has ever known. Leave behind your home, your family, and everything that you know, and go to the place that I am sending you. Why does Abraham leave? Because he is promised by God that he and Sarah will have a son, and from them a nation will arise that will be for the blessing of the entire world. It is by faith, trust in these promises, that Abraham gets going on that journey. He places his life in God's hands and goes out believing deep in his heart that what God has pledged to him is trustworthy and true. But this journey of faith is one of unsettled conviction. Abraham spends 25 years waiting for those promises to be fulfilled. Abraham and Sarah both struggle at times to maintain trust. Their faith sags under the weight of delayed promise. They even tried to fulfill those promises themselves in an act that violates the humanity of one of their slaves with Hagar, and Abraham has a child with her. God must continually remind Abraham and Sarah that what they have been promised is true. And so they stubbornly cling to trust. They hold on to faith. Even after their son Isaac is born, they still look with hope toward the ultimate fulfillment of those promises that comes to us in Jesus Christ, in his life, his death, and in his resurrection. They look from a distance, this preacher says, and for they continue to trust, placing their faith in God that what they are waiting for is always beyond what they can see. To have faith is to live in that unsettled conviction that there is always something waiting beyond what is. In France during the Second World War, there was a Jewish family that was hidden in a basement waiting for and longing for the great hope of liberation, as many Jewish families were in Europe during that time. After the war ended, they found scribbled on the wall of the basement, "I believe in the sun even when it doesn't shine. I believe in love even when it's not given. I believe in God even when he is silent." Only trust in God, only hope for a vision waiting to be fulfilled could have written down those words. Placing our trust in the promises of God, straining toward our hope, is the very essence of faith. Faith is about holding on to hope. It's looking towards those things you cannot yet see. Faith is trusting that the vision we have been given is worth committing our lives to. It's worth committing our lives to love even when stories of hate fill the news. It's worth committing ourselves to mercy and generosity even when those cultural values of vindictiveness and selfishness are so much easier. It's worth committing our lives to acts of justice even when the impact is so hard to be measured. It's worth placing our hope that our lives are always held in the loving care of our God even when loss and pain surround us. Because those sorts of things are what our faith anticipates and longs for. So I pray that the gift of faith would grow within us, causing a spring of deep and abiding trust in God to burst forth. May our faith inspire us to hope for those things not yet seen but promised to us. May we, like Abraham, place our lives in God's hands and in faith walk toward a future that is not our own but belongs to God. Thanks be to God. Amen.